We have a fantastic evening lined up for us. My name is Sana Sharif, and I am a sophomore at Harvard College. I am the president of FRESI, the Facilitators for Religious, Ethical, and Spiritual Inquiry on campus, as well as a board member of the Harvard College Interfaith Forum. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Life Matters series featuring Imam Khalil Abdur-Rashid, Muslim chaplain at Harvard University, and the esteemed Professor Cornel West, an activist, a passionate intellectual, and professor of the practice of public philosophy here at Harvard. Tonight's event is the third discussion in the Life Matters series, a program designed and offered by Chaplain Khalil that gives Harvard students and community members a glimpse into the life stories of prominent members here of the Harvard community, the challenges they've faced, and the role of spirituality, religion, and ethics in their lives. At a time of tangible divisiveness among not only faith groups, but in the world at large, this kind of platform allows for us not only to get a glimpse into these life stories, but to learn from them. It provides an opportunity for humanization. Tonight's discussion will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. We invite you all to participate, and you can do so by following a link that will be projected on the screen to submit questions. 2 emergency exits are located immediately behind me on Holyoke Street, and there are also emergency exits available at the Massachusetts Avenue, Mount Auburn Street, and Dunster Street entrances at the Smith Center. And now, it is my great honor to introduce a dear friend and mentor, Chaplain Khalil Abdur-Rashid.
Thank you, Sana.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to, and I'm delighted to have all of you here. We're especially blessed and impressed to have Brother West here with us tonight. So we want to welcome you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, brother. Thank you. This is a special moment for us, and you know what we try to do here with the Life Matters program is hear the insights, the wisdom, the advice, the reflections of prominent people on campus so that we may be both inspired by their story, by their narrative, by their advice, and also so that we can find direction in a world where some of us have a tendency to feel a little bit lost. So, Professor West, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to begin, if you don't mind, at the beginning.
Yes,
If you wouldn't mind sharing with us whatever you'd like to, a little bit about your life story, your upbringing, the influences in your life as you were a young man, and what tell us a little bit about your story in a few minutes.
No, indeed. Well, first, I just want to salute my dear brother for his visionary leadership, his courageous leadership. He's a tremendous force for good in this community, in the country, and the world. So let's just give it up for our dear
Thank
brother.
you. Thank you.
Oh, Harvard is blessed. Harvard is blessed.
Thank you.
First lady,
Much
too.
love. Alhamdulillah.
Companion and partner and wife and things. Now I want to acknowledge, too, of course, our Jewish brothers and sisters having Yom Kippur tonight.
That's
They're
right.
undergoing that, and we have our prayers with them.
That's
But no, I am who I am because somebody loved me. I'll never be half the man my father was, Clifton West. He died 25 years ago. My mother's 87 years young, still going to elementary school named after her in Sacramento, California. I grew up on the chocolate side of Sacramento, California, so I'm an extension of the West family, Shiloh Baptist Church. Reverend Willie P. Cook was my pastor. He was a loving, sacrificial, visionary pastor who helped shape my soul. Deacon Hinton, head of the deacon board, and Sarah Ray, head of the Vacation Bible School, Sunday school. And so by the time I arrived at Harvard 50 years ago, I was already ready to take on a highly colonizing and incorporating experience. So I would already want to be able to preserve the best that was already in me so I wouldn't be shaped in the worst of Harvard's image, of all the arrogance and condescension and looking down on everyday people, losing sight of the humanity of those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. And at the same time, I would allow myself to be shaped in the best of Harvard's image, of W.B. Du Bois and a whole host of others who did come through here and was able actually to build on the best of what Harvard has. But I was going to shape Harvard in the best of my image too. You see, so I was going to bring James Brown, and I was going to bring some Donny Hathaway and Aretha Franklin. I was going to bring Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer and a host of others. And it's precisely that kind of mutual reciprocal interplay that makes Harvard at its best a fascinating place, and then the critique of Harvard at its worst as a site for the ruling class to engage in its formation to generate elites too often who are indifferent and callous to poor and working people all around the world, every good part of it. So that in that sense, I've been very, very blessed, brother. Very blessed indeed. But it's that love and that nurture and that care that I want to acknowledge from the West family in Sacramento.
Right. How do you see opportunities for students who come here who don't have the same infrastructure of love that you had? Do you encounter students like that? How do you advise them? Where do you advise them to go if you're dealing with students who are coming here and may be vulnerable to either side of the challenges of being at Harvard, or even be isolated? What in your time here and your life experiences here, what are the sources of love that they can tap into if they didn't find that growing up?
Find it at home. That's a wonderful question, because usually I have to simply learn and listen from them. Because for people who haven't received the unbelievable and incredible love from mom and dad and grandma and granddad and aunts and uncles, that's alien to my experience. No matter what color you are, no matter what your religious identity and so forth, everybody needs to receive love and learn how to give love. So I was blessed to have that early on. And for the students who come, and what you got, 21% of the students wrestling with overwhelming depression, a whole host of students who are feeling so detached from their significant others, I would say you've got to be able to make sure you have mentors, friends. You can join mosques, churches, synagogues, temples, sport, music, apprenticeship, networks, all the different ways in which your soul can be cared and nurtured. And this is very different than just networking. You see, Harvard is a site of market-driven making connections. And that has it's a role, but I hope it has a limited role, because in the end it's spiritually empty and it's morally vacuous. It's transactional rather than transformative. And for those of us who come out of the legacy of Jerusalem, we're concerned about transformation. We're not just concerned about transaction. We're not just making connections. There's a qualitative difference, as James Baldwin wrote to Lorraine Hansberry, between keeping faith and making it. And if you just want to make it, then go on and be titillated and stimulated and get that dynamite job and get that big money and live in some vanilla suburb and think you're going to feel good about yourself before the world gets your body. That's about as empty as it gets.
That's right.
But if you want that deep education, then you're going to have to learn how to examine yourself, break bread with the dead, learn how to find your voice in relation to the voices of the dead. And whatever particular tradition it is, Islamic, Christian, Judaic, Buddhist, Hindu, secular, and so forth. And I do believe that precious Muslim brothers and sisters have a very, very special role to play right now in the history of Harvard, given international relations and given what's going on all around the world. Very, very unique role to play, crucial role to play, and that's another reason why Harvard is so blessed to have you here, though, brother.
So let me, because you're opening up a can, so let's open it up. Let's unpack it.
That's true.
So am I hearing you correctly? Are you saying that there is a role for religion and spirituality at Harvard?
Oh, it's indispensable. It is more than crucial. You see. Harvard itself goes back to the left wing of the Reformation, with the Puritans founding this place in order to generate clergy, because they believed that religion was indispensable for the highly limited democratic experiment that they're attempting to build in light of the settler colonial enterprise and the imperial enterprise in the background that is the beginnings of what this institution and what America's all about. And that was true then, and now the question becomes, what are the forms of religiosity and spirituality that play a fundamental role in sustaining human beings with courage, with compassion, with a sensibility of not just conversation, but being in solidarity across a variety of different fences and lines, as it were. And so, you know, when we talk about life matters, Muslim life matters, not just here at Harvard, but in the Middle East, in Asia, in the United States, in Latin America, and so forth. And we're living in the midst of an American empire where it's clear that a Muslim life has had much less value and continues to have much less value than non-Muslim life. So you got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Muslims who have been killed by U.S. imperial policies, and there's no serious talk about it, no serious attention to it. And everybody knows if those were other kinds of lives, it would be very different. See, we saw this with the U.S. drone when they killed an American. What happened when they killed that American? Well, we were lying. We said that we were not killing innocent people, but we killed American innocent people. And what happened? They had a news conference that same day, and they got economic compensation for life, and they got a public apology. But all those Muslim lives in Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, a whole host of other countries, denial, as if that American life has more value than that Muslim life. And we have to be consistent morally and spiritually in terms of, if we talk about life matters, a Muslim life has exactly the same value as my fellow Christians, as secular folk, as Buddhists, as Hindus, as Jewish across the board. And that generates then what I would argue is the need for always, at Harvard or any other place, the primacy of the moral and the spiritual always tied to a systematic analysis of the structures of domination in place and the forms of resistance and critique of those structures of domination. They go hand in hand. And it means, in fact, then you're going to get in a whole lot of trouble, because to try to be consistent and talk about life matters across the board is going to pit you over against powers that be they imperial, be they patriarchal, be they homophobic, transphobic, white supremacist, or what have you, you see. And I would even go further in terms of Muslim life at Harvard. You see, there's no way myself, as a revolutionary Christian, bearing witness that I can be settled or accepting of the distribution of space and resources at Harvard, in which we Christians are hegemonic with the big old church in the middle of the yard, and the Muslim brothers and sisters got to find different places in order to engage in worship. That's a Keith Sweat moment. Something just ain't right. It's wrong. There needs to be some fundamental reflection about, how does Muslim lives matter? U.S. imperial policy around the world. How does it matter at Harvard University? To make sure that there's dignity and space and resources relative to not just the presence of Muslims, but the acknowledgement of the major contribution of Muslims at Harvard in 2019. And so the notion of the Christian hegemony at work in regard to space, resources, and so forth. And I'm just throwing this out because I just want you to know, brother, as you move, I'm in solidarity with you.
All right.
Don't know
All
anything
right.
that about
All
that.
right.
Now, I do it in the name of Jesus. And he does it in the name of Allah.
That's it.
fine.
That's it. We all on the
Fine.
same page.
We absolutely
So-
talk about fairness, justice, and making sure people are able to worship in dignity,
That's right.
proceed in dignity,
That's right.
and flower and flourish in the context of Harvard University.
So now you're talking about flipping and deconstructing the whole sort of epistemology of how we go about higher education of young folks in America, and particularly at Harvard, But also what I hear from you is a reassessment of values or reprioritization, or shall I say the construction of new values. Speak about that if you can. Is there a need for new values, a need to rethink old values, or the introduction of a new concept of value?
Yeah, well, that's a profound question. I'm old school. I think that the old values of integrity, honesty, decency, courage, vision, concerned about the least of these, coming out of 25th chapter of Matthew, that's enough for me in one lifetime to try to come to terms. What have we got to come to terms? What are the new circumstances and conditions? How is our courage? How is our integrity? How is our honesty? How is our love? How is our justice applicable to these new circumstances and conditions? Be it here at Harvard, anywhere around the world. So when people say new values, I say, well, what kind of values are you thinking about beyond courage, vision, integrity, honesty, decency, generosity? You got something else to add to that? They say, yeah, then I have to learn and listen. But even when I learn and listen, they usually say something that is already subsumed by the one that that's already in place. So I do have a certain tie to the best of what I call the prophetic traditions of the legacy of Jerusalem and the Socratic legacy of Athens too. The questioning, the self-examination, the self-interrogation, that's important. And then historical sociology. How do we understand empire? How do we understand capitalism? How do we understand patriarchy? These systems of domination that so often lose sight of the rich humanity of persons all around the world.
If we're coming to that, or we want to come to that Jerusalem center, we want to come to those values. We know it, but we don't practice. Or we get creative with other folks, other philosophical approaches, and mask them as values, perhaps, or other agendas that are more convenient. So how do we go about, and how do we go about the business of restoring our originality, our authenticity? How do we cultivate the spiritual core of ourselves when we've got so much that's masked up with material and non-spiritual readings and exposing?
I think that we have to aspire to be fallible exemplars of the best of the traditions that have shaped us. So that people have to be able to see how you relate, how you speak, how you act, to make the connection between your various deeds and some of the seeds that you try to plant. And those examples become the catalyst for the larger waves of spiritual, moral, and political awakening that shatter indifference and callousness toward the suffering of others. And if we're in a moment like we're in a moment now, where it's escalating crypto-fascism, it's escalating reactionary nationalism, there's more and more persons who are downbeat when it comes to generating alternatives to the various structures of domination in place, forms of hatred, envy, contempt, running amok, and what have you. People need to see examples that are countervailing forces against what is dominant in our society. And that becomes the real catalyst, not the cause, but the catalyst of people willing to think differently, act differently, relate differently. And so exemplars, grand examples, past and present, variety of different traditions, religious and non-religious. We've got a lot to learn from secular traditions in terms of great examples. People whose love is overwhelming. Somebody like my dear brother Edward Zaid, we spent 40 years together. And he's secular to the core, even though he had a little Protestant sensibility if you tease deep enough. But he's secular to the core. He used to tell me, Brother West, you and I are on the same wavelength up until the point of religion. And I said, that's just your secular bias. I appreciate that. Let's have a large conversation about your understanding of secularity and what went into the shaping of you such that you are so critical of religious institutions, and him calling himself always a secular critic. And yet when it came to his example, solidarity, justice, love, concerned about the least of these, he becomes indispensable in any serious conversation about what it is to be a human being, what it is to be a Muslim, what it is to be a Christian, what it is to be a Buddhist, what it is to be a Hindu. And he's just one major example. I think he's probably the greatest public intellectual of the latter part of the 20th century, along with Noam Chomsky, of the American empire, you know. And that was a real challenge to have a Palestinian brother who was leading public intellectual in the United States. America's yet to fully come to terms with that.
Right.
But he's, as example, even he's in the second, even though but he's also, you know, he's Edward, so he's got a lapsed Protestant background in terms of the shaping of who he was. But he broke and decided to move in a secular direction.
How do we here support and foster spaces in the absence of a singular space? How do we support spaces for students to feel that religious, spiritual, and ethical life has a place at Harvard that's not in the periphery, but that is an integral component of their experience here on campus, and for that matter in general, in society, in the larger society as well?
I think that there needs to be continual conversation, colloquium, very much like we're doing now. That's got to be constitutive of student life and faculty and staff life.
Faculty and staff life.
Absolutely.
Very nice.
You can't have a university without staff. You can walk around and feel good about yourself and talk about how smart and clever you is, but let the staff go on strike for about 5 days. And you see how long Harvard survives, you see. And they got a whole lot of critical reflection to shape. But the students, but also faculty is very important. So that the curriculum begins to also be shaped by the rich traditions that we're talking about as part and parcel of what is the role of Harvard, what is the role of the United States in the world. So that I think what we have, you know, at Harvard for the most part is dialogue, serious, sustained, self-involved, self-emptying dialogue. And by self-emptying, it's got to be a kenosis. And this is very difficult at Harvard, especially among my fellow faculty members, because kenosis means you have to be vulnerable. You can't come in with an authoritative status because you know so much. You have to be willing to allow your learned ignorance to be the spotlight as well as your learnedness. That's a genuine conversation. That's not pontification. And it's very difficult for professors anywhere. It's very difficult for, you know, just the chattering wings of any bourgeoisie around the world. That tends to look down on everyday people and think somehow they're benighted and you were so enlightened. Get off the crack pipe. You got a lot to learn and listen. They got a lot to learn and listen in terms of everyday people yourself as a professional or academic or what have you. And anybody who's been in the streets, been to jail, been in social movements, you know how much you learn from folk who are not in the academy.
Right.
And yet they still got something to learn from you too. It's mutual, it's reciprocal all the way down. And that's why, I mean, I hope that we make this thing an annual or every semester. I'd just love to sit and talk with you.
All right.
Well,
we're going to do it. We're going to do it.
We have wonderful meals one-on-one.
That's right. That's right.
But just to be able to have our conversations spill over.
That's right.
And you all kind enough to take time out of your short lives to come and allow us to speak. You're not here that long. Let's just be honest about it. You're not here that long. But it's a beautiful thing, and there's so many other voices beside mine that is crucial. But and then maybe even we can begin to see Harvard really enter in kind of harmony in which religious faiths are treated fairly and justly across the board, even as we continue to not just respect each other, but engage each other. You know, the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in his famous essay, 1965, "No religion is an island." And he says that the major ecumenical movement around the world is nihilism. I would just rephrase it, gangsterism. And gangsterism comes in every religion. There's Christian gangsters, Jewish gangsters, Buddhist gangsters, Islamic gangsters, Hindu gangsters, secular gangsters. He says, and the countervailing force is interfaith. And I'm including the secular tradition in this sense. And there's got to be solidarity against gangsterism, against the Thrasymachus of the world, the Grand Inquisitors in Dostoevsky's novel. Those are the gangsters and thugs that will use arbitrary power in order to reproduce their hierarchies and structures of domination and allow hatred and envy and contempt to be integral to how they proceed in the world. And if we don't have countervailing forces against it incoming together, then we all go under. And let's be very honest, we're living at a moment where we are experiencing relative defeat in most parts of the world. Given the escalating crypto-fascisms and reactionary nationalisms that are running amok everywhere you go. And we've got our own gangster in the White House. So I begin, at home. I begin in my own empire.
That's right.
But I know there's a whole host of American citizens who are concerned about the integrity, honesty, decency, justice, love, service to others. That can be countervailing forces. They come in all colors, all genders, all sexual orientation, all traditions. So I think Heschel is making a very important point here in terms of the ways in which we work together.
Right.
Absolutely.
How do you stay grounded in the midst of all the muck that's out there? How do you stay grounded?
I was just telling my class today, I gave a lecture on Nietzsche. And I was saying, I'm from California, so for us, the ground sometimes more like a wave, given that the earth quakes and shakes so much. So it lets you know that any kind of grounding that you think you have is something that needs to be reconquered every day. Because the ground can be pulled out from under you any moment. Just in terms of the earth itself. Culturally, religiously, and so forth, as I said before, I'm a love child. All the love I received up until 15 years old was enough for 2 lifetimes. I hear the Isley brothers talk about a caravan of love. Curtis Mayfield talking about get on board, you don't need no ticket, get on the love train, the justice train. Hey, they talking about me. Because that's how I was shaped early on. Now that doesn't mean that I don't have, some ugly sides. I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and now I'm a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivity.
All right.
So I've got a whole lot of evil that I have to wrestle with every day. But because I receive so much, and this is true even at Harvard, we just buried Martin Kilson.
Yeah.
We just had the memorial for Kilson on Sunday, right here in Memorial Church, the first black tenured professor in the history of Harvard. 1969, Harvard's founded in 1636. 333 years, the first black tenured professor. And he was my mentor. His office right across the street here, 16 Appleton Court. So those are examples of people who love you, sacrifice, shape you, mold you in that way, you see. So that in that sense, it's grounded, but it's something is a dynamic, it's, as you know, it's not static. It's something that has to be redone, reconquered over and over and over again.
Right.
And dialogues with you, dialogues with Brandon Terry and Evelyn Higginbotham, and Skip Gates, and the other, whatever agreements or disagreements we have, there's ways in which we can come together to help sustain us as we try to make it through.
I want to give an opportunity now for our guests to ask questions. There's the link here, right on the screen here, so you can submit some of your questions. And many of you have already begun to submit some of your questions. So, Brother West, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn to some of the audience's questions and ask them since they're popping up here. So, we've got several here. In what ways do you attempt to reach across those fences you were talking about of difference, religious difference, and form meaningful connections or any kind of difference? What ways have been effective for you in being able to reach across the lines or across the fences, particularly, I would add, fences that other people erect to divide themselves from you? You might be willing to reach out, but what if they aren't?
Well, one is that you always attempt to show up.
Yeah.
You just show up. You know, if folk are not being treated right, you just try to be there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes I'm asked to be there, so I'm definitely there, but sometimes I don't even ask for their permission. I just try to be there and just let them know I care. That means you become multi-contextual, which is probably more important than multicultural. Multi-contextual means you go to a variety of different contexts and make your presence one in which the spirit of humility, not self-righteousness, not as some missionary coming in to save people, but as a human being to be in solidarity with other human beings across the board. So if the struggle's going on in the Middle East, just show up. Want to talk about Israeli occupation? Even though it gets you in trouble, who cares? You show up. You speak your mind. They're having troubles in Honduras and so forth, you show up. Dealing with the Dalit folk in India, you show up. Tibet, Kashmir, across the board. You're trying to have a moral and political consistency in that regard. And therefore, you want to say quite explicitly that, hey, this is how I try to live my life, really. You see. So that's, to me, the beginnings. You know,
Okay.
definitely. And especially when it's time to take a risk.
Not when it's convenient. You show up when it's convenient.
You don't show up after everybody else has caught hell and you show up with a smile. No. You want to be right there at the moment everybody else is catching hell. Go to jail together. Have an ecumenical prayer. Or you're in the background, reflecting on the process. You're learning, but also lifting your voice in that way. And that's what I think solidarity in the end is all about. Being willing to take a risk, being willing to bear witness and speak truths that may very well get you in deep trouble.
On that note, how should we manage the battle, the struggle between integrity and self-preservation?
Yeah, I mean, I come from a tradition that says love your neighbor as yourself, and therefore you got to have a proper self-love before you can actually love your neighbor in a proper way. I don't think proper self-love is about self-preservation. I think love is fundamentally a self-emptying and a self-donating and a self-giving to others. So you're always concerned much more about a giving than just a preserving. Now, in the end, one of the great paradoxes of love, of course, is that you end up receiving so much by trying to give so much. But you don't give in order just to get back. This is not quid pro quo. And therefore, self-preservation, which is much more the language of a Thomas Hobbes or some of our more narrow utilitarian brothers and sisters who were tied to maximizing self-interest. That's not my language at all. That is the language of the dominant ways of a world in which values and the systems need to be radically called into question. Now, on the other hand, proper self-love does have an element of self-interest, but it's just an element. It's just an element, you see. That's kind of inadequate. These questions require a seminar to come to terms with their richness.
Right.
I just taking stabs at it.
That's it. No. You're free. You're free. We want you to flow like the water here.
Lord, I appreciate that.
There's a couple of questions here that I want to group together
Yes.
that have to do with the issue of loss, death, sorrow. The general question is, in what ways has grief, sorrow, getting through loss, encounters with death, you mentioned you just went to a funeral, how has that impacted your life, your value? You mentioned love, but what about loss?
Yeah, I mean, it's very real, though, brother.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, at one of the deepest levels, to be human is to shudder and suffer and struggle with a loss, a grief, a sadness, a sorrow, and to try to forge, in light of our traditions, a joy. It's different than the pleasure, the dominant ways of the world. Joy cuts much deeper. Enduring. It's not titillation, stimulation. Sparkle in the eye of children, tears and laughter of your loved ones. It's an attempt to try to leave the world a little bit better than you found it in struggle. That's joy. Pleasure has a different level. And I'm not against pleasure. I'm a Christian, but I'm not a Puritan. Remember, the definition of a Puritan is somebody who's deeply upset that somebody somewhere is having pleasure. And that's the worst of the legacy of Princeton's of Harvard's Puritanicalism. That's not me. I'm a black Christian. We believe in the fall and a lot of other things with the cross, but that's another discussion. But this sense of wrestling with loss and keeping in mind again, that all of our traditions are so deeply tied to overwhelming loss and grief and sadness and sorrow.
Yeah.
It really, all of it. All of it. And I would say that's true for human beings across the board. Across the board.
So, how do we inspire radical change in ourselves in a time where fundamentally we are constantly encountering mediocrity, complacency, and different mechanisms that call society and us to the lower, baser sides of ourselves? Is love enough? And particularly for those people who might have experienced love, but conditional love, not unconditional love. So they begin to be conditioned for transactional relationships. Justice becomes transactional, relationships become transactional, education becomes transactional, and then transformation might become transactional. How do we exit that whole dialectic, that whole black hole of degradation?
Boy, that's a tough query. That's a tough one. Because we live in such a market-driven culture where anything could be commodified, where everybody and everything's up for sale. So the justice, hope, all of them could be commodified, all of them can be colonized, all of them can be used and deployed in order to reinscribe hierarchies and structures of domination. So the question then becomes, how, by means of our example, do we shatter and explode that kind of deployment of those categories that are so very precious? I mean, take, for example, Harvard. Now, Harvard is a neoliberal university that is profoundly corporatized and commodified. Parasitic on big money. It's run by bureaucrats who have been credentialized, highly professional. But major priority, more and more, is to make sure the billions are coming through and then provide professional and pre-professional education for students. Less and less Socratic. And what is professionalism? It's a particular way of being in the world that puts a premium on conformity, complacency, and cowardliness. So to be a polished professional is to be a very smart and clever person whose soul is well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference. And you're tied to the rat race of money, status, power, and honor. And remember, the winner of the rat race is still a rat. It doesn't speak to your spirit. It doesn't speak to your character. It doesn't speak to values. The best Islamic values, the best Christian values, the best Judaic values, the best secular values is not a rat. It's Malcolm X. It's Fannie Lou Hamer. It's Dorothy Day. These are human beings who refuse to be conformists, refuse to be complacent, and refuse to be cowardly. Now, I don't believe in I don't believe in just this Manichaean view of either you're courageous or cowardly. No, there's a lot of space in between because we all have to be prudential. But prudential is different than being opportunist. Opportunist means you have no values. You'll do anything. Just give me the money, the status, the position. Prudential means I've got some deep values. I've got some deep ties to my tradition, but I know I also got a wife and a husband and kids and cousins and parents and community, and I got to work this thing out. I don't want you to pray for me every week as I work it out. That's practical wisdom. Aristotle called Phronise says. That's different than opportunism in that way. But we've got now our precious young folk, by the time you're a freshman or sophomore, you're supposed to already know what you want to do professionally. You haven't even learned how to think critically yet. You don't even know what it is to really engage public life, civic life, be a citizen as opposed to just a consumer or just someone who's off getting this dynamite job because Wall Street's down on the way down to interview you, to offer you $500,000 your first year. See, these are the seeds of corruption spiritually and morally. But it is our world. It is our world. And thank God Harvard has possibilities within its corporatizing and commodifying tendencies, which are the dominant tendencies of this place. But there's spaces in between for some genuine education to take place. Not just skill acquisition and information, but transformation, critical reflection. And that's what makes Harvard, at its best, a place that's still worth being here. You know what I mean? And if it was solely that, we'd be wasting our lives. Life's too short to be dealing with that kind of spiritual emptiness. You got other things to do. Now, how do you engage in radical change? No one has control over that. We bear witness. You try to generate social motion, maybe social momentum, and every once in a while you get a social movement. And when you get a social movement, the repressive apparatus of any nation state will come down on you so hard that it will try to convince the younger generation. We only want you to be polished professionals. We don't want you to be love warriors or justice warriors. And I come from a black people. 400 years of being traumatized and terrorized and stigmatized. And yet we've been still trying to teach the world something about freedom and healing and something about love. I can just turn on John Coltrane, Love Supreme right now, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Or listen to a little Aretha, or read some James Baldwin, or some Toni Morrison. What is it about these people that they still dishing out these love warriors, not these narrow polished professionals, in light of all the terror they had to come to terms with? Of slavery, neo-slavery, and now Jim Crow Jr. That's operating. But see, that's a spiritual question. That's a moral question. Strong political consequences.
Right.
And it comes through all the different traditions. Black Islamic folk, the black Christians, the black Buddhists like bell hooks, the black Hindus, black secular folk at our best. But it is getting weaker and more feeble as we move into the 21st century. The market's taking over. It's taking over. So we have to be very honest and candid about that. And radical change only comes when there's strong social movements, when there's tremendous conflict within the ruling class itself. One of the reasons why I teach at Harvard is to make sure there's not a wholesale consensus among the ruling class in the American empire of moving in a right-wing direction. Plus, I like ideas too, but you gotta create dissensus, you gotta create conflict, you gotta create contestation in high places of people who have access to tremendous wealth and power. Because there are people like the Vanderbilts who were communists, or Laura Rockefeller who funded so much of the feminist movement, or Lamont Library, Carlos Lamont, who was a left-wing socialist, one of the founders of ACLU. These are all Harvard people. John Reed, we can go on and on and on. There's spaces for Socratic dialogue that creates conflict at the highest level. Because no matter how much unity you have among oppressed people, if the powers that be at the top have wholesale consensus and unity and unanimity, it's still going to be difficult to generate radical change.
Yeah.
You've got to have conflict at the top, and you've got to have strong unity at below, and then the middle classes have to make decisions. Because usually they milk warm. They have to make decisions. They're either going with the powers that be, or lo and behold, they're taking a stand with folk who are catching him. And so, I mean, that's a kind of a sketch in terms of how any kind of radical change can take place. And when the radical change does take place, for me, it's important that there be some deep democratic sensibilities and procedures so that after radical change takes place, you don't just reproduce another form of hierarchy with folk at the top who are unaccountable and unanswerable. And we've seen this over and over again in places all around the world.
Can you sit at the table of power and not be a sellout?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Definitely. Very much. But you need a whole lot of friends and a whole lot of accountability in your family, institutions, and social movements to make sure that you're not seduced by the carrots that the powers that be have for you. That's difficult. But oh, absolutely. I believe that a person of integrity can go into any house, from White House to crack house, and leave with their integrity. That's what it is, that be spiritually intact. And I'm not talking about being perfect or pristine, but to be spiritually intact. It's possible to come to Harvard and become empowered and enabled and leave stronger with your spiritual integrity intact. But you better spend a whole lot of time around folk at Harvard who are in Harvard but not of Harvard. Because folk who have been infected by Harvarditis, which is the worship of Harvard, which is idolatry. And somewhere I read, thou shalt have no other gods beside me. Allah is great.
That's right.
No alternatives.
That's right.
Our Jewish brothers and sisters say the same thing in Hebrew scripture.
That's right.
Christians say the same thing in Hebrew scripture.
That's
Our secular brothers and sisters can be anti-idolatrous too. But it's just the alternative would be equality, democracy, freedom, liberty, God bless you, rather than an appeal to a deity. But the accountability is so very important. That's why friendships that we have are so very important.
That's right.
Man.
That's right.
Very much so. Because I know, I fall to my face all the time, and I'm always reminded by my friends, Brother West, you're messing up, brother. I say, tell me more. I want to know.
That's right. That's right.
I'm not always convinced I am, but when I am, I want to know. I want to know. Absolutely.
So here's something I want to know, if you're willing to share it. What can you share with us two things, if you don't mind? A crisis you had that you got through, and then one of the most spiritually transformative moments you had?
Wow, that's heavy. No, let me see. It was 2000. I just had my dialogue with Brother Larry Summers back in 2001 or so, when he brought me in his office and was upset that I was connected with hip hop and a lot of other things. So we had a real intense dialogue on that. And right after I discovered that I had cancer in the last stage, and they had given me about 2.5 months to live. That was 2001. I was 48 years old. And I remember I called my brother. My brother's a deacon at Shiloh Baptist Church, and he's one of the most magnificent persons you ever meet in your life, just like my sister. And I said, well, Big Cliff, I guess the Lord is done using me. I have been invited to the banquet of life for 48 years. I had an embarrassment of riches. My life has been thoroughly blessed. It's time to go and make space for some other folk. And he said, no, we're going to fight this. I said, so, all right, I'm going to fight it, but I got to get ready, you know. And it's hard for them to explain, because I'm now 66. What is that? That's 18 years later. I'm still going. You know what I mean? What can you say? Still going, you know, fighting it all the time, but still going. So in that sense, you know, you're not just humbled, but you're made aware just how precious life and time actually is, really, definitely. In terms of spiritually uplifting, God, there's just so many examples I've had in my life, you know, with my family and kids, and in various struggles. It could be in Standing Rock with indigenous peoples. It could be dealing with police brutality in Ferguson or Charlottesville. Any form of struggle I find great joy in, because you're just trying to leave the world just a little better than you found it, you see. I was told in Sunday school when I was about 8 years old, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind.
Beautiful.
And it's this sense of how much heaven are you leaving behind in terms of witness, in terms of truth-telling, in terms of touch, in terms of grin, because all of us doing a lot of damage. We can just assume that, because we all have a wretchedness about us, but we have something wonderful about us too, you see. And those moments in which you feel as if the heaven, the little heaven that you're trying to leave behind, actually has some efficacy and some potency and some impact. That's a tremendous joy. Not pleasure, tremendous joy. And the same is true in the classroom. Same is true in the classroom, you see. We got a strike coming up, right? For the graduate students. I'm in wholesale solidarity with the graduate students, going to be on the picket line with a smile on my face. Why? Because they're not being treated fairly, at least for me. You see. And it just becomes another occasion where you're able to bear a certain kind of witness, you see, and help push against the powers that be. You see. And it's not hatred at all. Well, it is hatred of a certain kind. It is. You remember the Puritan Joseph Press gave a lecture here in Cambridge in 1366 on classical and charitable Christian hatred. And of course, it basically comes down to hating the sin and trying to love the sinner. You hate the injustice, you hate the domination, you hate the oppression, but you try to stay in contact with the humanity of those who are perpetuating it, because they are still on the human continuum like you. They just got more gangster proclivities. But you got some proclivities inside of you too, you see. And that's my conception of hatred. So we're doing the Obama years, and people say, oh, Brother West, you hating on Obama all the time. I thought, I'm hating on his Wall Street connections. I'm hating on the drones he's dropping on innocent people. I'm hating on the 26,171 bombs he's dropping on 7 countries, most of whom are Muslim, and the press won't say a mumbling word. I am that kind of hater. I'm a Christian hater. of various forms of sin and evil and domination and oppression. Yes, I am. Because when you try to love people, you hate the fact they're being treated unjustly.
That's right.
You loathe the fact they're being treated unfairly. And I come from a tradition that if we don't do something and say something, the rocks are going to shout out and sing a song. And music is fundamental for me, for not just religion, but who we are as human beings. Who we are as human beings. The transfiguring of the despair and the grief into song is indispensable, fundamental. And it's partly because I come from a people who have had to deal with the reality. When Henry Highland Garnett came together for the first Negro convention in 1837 in Philadelphia, he said, "Black people in America, never confuse your situation with that of the Israelites in the Old Testament, Christian Old Testament. For black people, Pharaoh is on both sides of the bloody Red Sea." Right when you think your exodus is taking place and you're moving through the Jordan, there's Pharaoh waiting on the other side. That's the history of black people in America in many ways. Emancipation Proclamation, here comes neo-slavery for Jim Crow and James Crow and American terrorism and lynching. You break the back of American apartheid in the 60s, here comes neoliberal and conservative policies that engage in mass incarceration, decrepit schools, massive unemployment and underemployment, low-quality education, and make some place for the unprecedented access of middle-class black people. So your bourgeoisie will be bigger, but your black poor and your black working class poor will be devastated. And they're supposed to live vicariously through the success of the black middle classes and the upper classes. That's nothing but Pharaoh in another form. Because when you look at the world through the lens of the cross for a Christian, you're always looking at how is the prisoner, how is the poor, how is the widow, how is the orphan, how is the motherless, how is the fatherless, how are they doing first and foremost. Don't tell me how Sister Oprah's doing. I'm glad that she's successful, but I'm not impressed just with her money. I want to know what she's doing with it, because success and greatness are qualitatively different, and the greatness of a person has nothing to do with their worldly success. It has to do with the quality of their life vis-a-vis service to others, vis-a-vis courage, compassion, love, mercy, the things that we in the Muslim and Christian communities elevate in our ritual and in our liturgies and so forth, you see. So in that sense, you know, we have smiles on our faces, but we got fire in our souls, given what we're up against right now. Very much so.
That being the case, how have you dealt with failures in your life? Personal failures, mistakes you've made? How have you gone through that? We all are challenged by our failures. I sit with students, I've sat with students who have made tremendous mistakes, and they think, you know, the world is coming to an end. They're 18, 19, 20 years old. On the other hand, I've sat with students who about to graduate from Harvard, and for them, the first kid to go to college in their family, and they're at Harvard, they're about to graduate, and for them, that's success. They can't think of anything past that, so they're like, why should I live anymore? Because after that, I've reached the pinnacle. So how do you deal with failure, perceived failure, mistakes, or even perceived success that's not really success?
Well, I've had so many failures in my life, though, brother, that you remember those lines in the last work of fiction by the great Samuel Beckett. He talks about try again, fail better. Try again, fail better. I think that's the story of most of our lives, that we end up trying to fail better because we always fall short. Now, there's another essay that's worth reading by the great Tennessee Williams called The Catastrophe of Success. that he wrote right after the Glass Menagerie in 1947. And he talked about what success will do to you too often that will disempower you in the long run. So in the sprint, you might win, but as a marathoner in living, you run up against a dead end if you're not spiritually equipped and morally ready to live a life. Because as we know, crisis and catastrophe, they both are on their way to our house. Your mama's gonna die, your daddy's gonna die, your loved ones are gonna die, you're gonna have friends who betray you, you're gonna undergo all kinds of failure, you're gonna be deeply disappointed and disenchanted. That's part of what it is to be human. The question is, what is the nature of your bounce back? How are you gonna come back? What will you learn? What kind of maturity will you accrue from those various failures, you see? And that's what I've always tried to remember, that I'm in a perennial process of trying to bounce back. But I have a lot of joy in the process. I don't want this to be cast as some kind of overarching burden. You see, I'm a jazz man in the life of the mind. And the jazz man, a jazz woman could be going through hell and high water. When they pick up the trumpet by Louis Armstrong or Mary Lou Williams sits at that piano, you better get ready for some heaven coming your way. When Nina Simone raises her voice, she's going to give you some heaven, but she's living hell. Billie Holiday sings about good morning heartache. She's talking about catastrophe, but you getting some heaven. Well, you see, that's what it is to engage in a kenosis, a self-emptying for the end of empowering others, for the aim of empowering others, you see. And that's a magnificent way of being in the world. It really is. It's a magnificent. It really is.
So, Brother West, we're going to close with one final question. After all you've been through, all you've seen, your process, failure, success, the continued struggle, personal struggles with an illness, political struggles for morality and justice in society, and life is short. We know we're all going to be hit with crisis.
That's right.
But still, you persist. Still, you keep going. You're beautiful and you're positive about it. So now the question that I want you to answer and leave us all with, going home thinking about. With everything that's going on, everything you've accumulated so far, why does life matter? In the midst of all of this crisis, why does life matter?
Well, I sure appreciate this dialogue, brother, because I'm falling short in these answers to it, but I'm having a good time.
No, I'm in heaven now.
Oh, I'm having a good time. Because you can raise some deep questions, my brother. Lord, yeah. But for me, when I think about life as a Christian, it's not just we made in the image and likeness of God. It's not just that we all have the potential to be changed and transformed, but there is a certain magnanimity in sweet surrender to something greater and grander than you. There is a sublimity to acknowledging your dependence on those who came before and your dependence on something greater than you. Some people call it piety. But piety is not blind obedience to dogma. It's not uncritical deference to doctrine. Piety is the recognition of the sources of good in your life from your mama's womb to tomb. And there's a sublimity about acknowledging that dependence as you emerge, finding your voice, who you are, and what your vocation and mission is. And I'm talking about your calling, not just your career. I'm talking about your vocation, not just your profession. I'm talking about your life task, not just your job. You see. And then the third pillar is the majesty of joyful gratitude. just being here. We sitting here looking at all these beautiful faces and people and so forth. That's a beautiful feeling. If I was a serious musician, I'd go home and write a song. It's true. Gratitude, just an acknowledgement of the thanks for being alive.
That's right.
And when you have those three pillars, that equips you to be ready for whatever it is. Now, what sits at the center of the legacy of Jerusalem, of all three, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is choosing life. Choosing life. And religion itself, in many ways, is choosing life in the consciousness of impotence. Even when you're helpless, you choose life and you fall back on. Surrender to something bigger. You fall back on. Dependence on something bigger. You fall back on. Gratitude to the something bigger. I mean, there's a wonderful line in Chesterton's text. I think it's Orthodox, or is it St. Francis of Assisi? I think it's Orthodox, where he said, you know, I just feel so bad for the atheists. I pity the atheists, even though I love the atheists. He says, I pity the atheists because right at the moment when you want to give thanks, there's nobody to thank. And there's something about the acknowledgement of wanting to give thanks. Because even the atheist has to want to give thanks. Because there is something about being alive that generates us wanting to be thankful.
That's right.
You see.
That's right.
Even given all the hell that's out there, all the evil that's out there, all the grimness that's out there, you see. And so this sense of gratitude and acknowledging dependence for the purposes of bearing witness and being a free Muslim, a free Christian, a free whatever. You see. But then, of course, is the challenge of the overwhelming sadness and sorrow, all of the tears of heartache and heartbreak that was in the world before you got here, is in the world still, and will be still up at work when you leave. That is something you got to be equipped to deal with, or you end up caving in, giving up, or selling out. And you got to bear prophetic witness as Muslims, as Christians, whatever, with that smile on your face. And I like that smile. You got though, brother. You got that smile. You got that smile. Lord, this is
Thank
rich.
you, Brother West.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank
Have a
this
blessed night.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.